May 1, 1942, Inland Sea, Japan. Aboard the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, rocked gently at anchor, the sea calm and blue outside. But inside her steel heart, the stakes were anything but calm. The mess hall had been transformed. Tables cleared. In their place, a massive scale map of the Pacific 40 feet across, gridded and labeled, covered in hand-carved wooden blocks and thin wire markers. Representing thousands of ships stretched across thousands of miles, a game table. But this wasn't a game. Rear Admiral Ugaki stood at its edge, arms behind his back, posture rigid. His black uniformed staff circled the room in uneasy silence. Around him sat 20 senior admirals, their faces stoic. White gloves, gold trim, folders of operational plans stacked high. The target was Midway. The plan was everything Yamamoto dreamed. A deadly trap. A knockout blow. Now the simulation began. On the first day, the pieces moved as expected. Japan advanced. Americans reacted as planned. Waves of Japanese aircraft bombed targets. Submarines prowled the edges. Umpires rolled dice. Staff recorded outcomes. Then on day 2, everything changed. A junior officer playing the Americans made an unscripted move. He launched land-based bombers from Midway at the exact moment Japanese carriers were vulnerable decks, full of fueled planes. Rearming for Strike 2.LT, CMDR, Okomiya rolled the dice. The result? 9 hits. 9. The room shifted. Some fingers twitched. Papers were clenched. Air stood still to carriers Akagi, and COG destroyed according to the combat damage tables. Just like that, Ugaki leaned forward. Read the result. And frowned. Reduce it. 3 hits. No explanation. Kaga was still sunk Akagi. Only damaged. Now the dice spoke truth. Ugaki rewrote it anyway, and in that moment, before a single bullet was fired at Midway, Japan's fate was already sealed. Not by the enemy, but by refusing to listen to a role they didn't like. By May 1942, Japan wasn't just winning the war, it was crushing it in 6 months. The rising sun had spread across the Pacific like wildfire. Everywhere it went, steel followed. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. 6 carriers launch over 350 aircraft in a surprise Sunday morning strike. Battleships. Burn. Arizona explodes. America bleeds. The world watches as the U.S. Navy is gutted before breakfast. December 10th, barely 72 hours later, British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse are stalked and sunk by Japanese bombers off Malawaya. In 10 days. Japan has humiliated 2 empires that once ruled the seas, the myth of untouchable. Western naval might dies before the year even ends. January, Tokyo's flag plants itself in Manila. February, 85,000 British troops surrender Singapore. The Gibraltar of the East, without a final stand. March, the Dutch East Indies fall. Oil secured. April, Rangoon, Burma, gone. Every new broadcast is a trumpet of dominance. Another victory, another island. The war is already ours, and Tokyo begins to believe it. Not quietly, not cautiously, with banners. With parades, with speeches that echo like prophecy. Pilots of the Mitsubishi Zero are treated like demigods. The aircraft is unmatched, faster, sharper, longer range. No Allied fighter can out-earn it. No pilot can out-climb it. They're not just winning skies, they're owning them, Commander. Nagumo is hailed as the fist of the fleet. Yamamoto's name whispers like a storm in dark rooms. Ugaki quietly in his shadow tightens his grip on the plan that will end the war. It's no longer about victory. That's expected. It's about how spectacular the final blow can be when it lands. Midway is chosen with confidence. A trap, beautifully woven. Lure the Americans. Crush. The last of their carrier strength. Force peace on Japanese terms. The Navy doesn't review this plan with doubt. It reviews it with pride. And pride rewrites risk strategists. Call it Kessen Kosen, the decisive battle doctrine, a single clash that will break America's back before their factories can catch up. They want it. They need it, because the longer the war drags on, the more America's machines awaken. Japan must win while it still feels unbeatable, but no one says that out loud. Instead, they say, Our carriers are untouchable. Our pilots are the air-made flesh. The enemy is afraid. We are destiny. And that belief, that hunger, grows into doctrine, into orders, into blindness. Historians will later call it victory disease, a parasite of arrogance. It rots planning, corrupts war games, silences those who say, "What if we fail?" Because failing is no longer acceptable. It's no longer possible. When success comes easy, denial becomes policy. And on May 1st, 1942, aboard the Yamato, there's no room left at the table for honesty. The war game is underway. The dice have started dancing, and Japan believes they can only fall one way. Inside the mess hall of the Yamato, the air was humid with sweat, starch, and tension muted beneath empire-colored uniforms. The war game continued. Wooden ships stood still on the Pacific tabletop, fleets meticulously carved and placed with geometry, not imagination. Colored pushpins marked carrier strike groups, invasion routes, submarine screens, and American reaction forces. Small dice sat near each corner, waiting to reveal a universe the planners thought they already controlled. At the center of it all stood Rear Admiral Ugaki, Chief of Staff to Yamamoto. He wasn't here to play. He was here to protect, to ensure that the operation proceeded as planned. That the Midway strike, Yamamoto's master plan, was validated on the board, and soon in blood. And that meant no surprises. Day 2, the simulation, had advanced to the moment when Nagumo's carriers were launching their strike on Midway Island. Aircraft fully loaded, decks bustling with teams arming and fueling planes. Anti-ship ordnance prepared for a possible American fleet. Then, the unthinkable happened. A young officer playing the American side made a bold move. He launched Midway's land-based bombers at Nagumo's carriers. Exactly the kind of opportunistic, instinctive strike that happened a month later in real life. Nagumo's decks were wide open, vulnerable, flaming kettles waiting for ignition. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, the umpire for that phase, rolled the dice. High, too high. A result of 9 strikes. According to the rule's standard doctrine, accepted by all, the result was disaster. 2 carriers sunk Akagi and Kaga around the table. Chairs shifted, breaths held. Ugaki leaned in, read the result, and blinked, not twice, just once, short, then, gently but clearly, he said. Downscale the outcome, changed to 3 hits. Kaga lost, Akagi only damaged. Someone coughed. Nobody objected. Okumiya lowered his head. His pen hesitated. He had done what was asked, and he would do it again, because in this room, the truth was not a priority. Loyalty was, and in that moment, the war game changed from simulation into ritual. From test. Into performance. Nothing else that happened during the next 48 hours mattered more than this, because when the rules failed to serve the narrative, the rules were discarded. Umpires no longer enforced. Chaos, they managed morale. Junior officers with questions kept them quiet, and behind tufted gold buttons and white gloves, Ugaki had made his choice. There were others who noticed. Commander Minoru Genda, architect of Pearl Harbor, raised quiet concern. He feared the plan assumed too much, believed too easily. He spoke gently. He was dismissed just as gently. To challenge Ugaki was to challenge Yamamoto. And no one challenged Yamamoto, not over dice. Elsewhere, inside notebooks and side eyes, someone scribbled a silent version of the game, one where sinking carriers meant delay. Reevaluation, maybe even a redesign. But none of those became part of the final report. In that version, Japan could have learned it, could have positioned its carriers differently. Refined reconnaissance, adjusted flight deck procedures, broken its doctrine against the anvil of caution. Instead, they broke logic and called it unity. The board game continued into a 4th day. More decisions made, more risks, overwritten, more dice dismissed. When one scenario placed American carriers forward, ready for early strikes, uncomfortably accurate in hindsight, it was ruled unrealistic. The Americans would not anticipate us. Their carriers are still at Pearl. Keep them there. And the war game continued. By the time it ended, Japan hadn't revised a single operational detail. Midway was validated. Victory was confirmed. Hesitations were buried. The enemy will do what we expect. Our ships will prevail, as always. There is no flaw, for carriers burned in that room, They just didn't smell it yet. Ugaki had seen disaster in the dice and rewritten it anyway, all to avoid the most dangerous word in a room full of admirals: doubt. The dice had been silenced. The war game had ended with the illusion of victory now. The real ships prepared to move, following a plan that had already failed where it was safest to fail. On a table, but no one spoke of that. Now the Midway operation was approved, finalized, signed, by men too high to question, too proud to look. Again, Japan's great trap was in motion. Admiral Yamamoto's fleet, the most powerful armada ever launched in the Pacific cut through the dark waters of the inland sea toward open ocean. 4 carriers at its core, Akagi Kaga, and hear you all, veterans of Pearl Harbor. All bathed in myth, they believed they were invincible. How could they not? No carrier had been lost in battle. Zeros ruled the sky in 6 months of victories. No meaningful American counterstrike had touched them. They would draw the remaining U.S. carriers into a kill zone, vaporize Midway's airfields, and ambush what was left of the Pacific Fleet as it scrambled to defend. Textbook, elegant, suicidal. There was one catch. The Americans already knew at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor. U.S. cryptanalysts had already broken much of Japan's JN-25 naval code, and they suspected the Japanese were coming for AF. But AF could mean anywhere. To prove it was Midway, Commander Joe Rochefort used a trick. He had Midway send a dummy message encrypted claiming the island's fresh water. The system had broken down. 2 days later, Japanese intelligence intercepted and relayed, AF is short on water. That was it. The Americans knew, and the trap had collapsed before it began. Admiral Chester Nimitz didn't wait. He sent carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown to sea immediately. Yorktown had just returned from the Battle of Coral Sea, damaged, burned, and leaking. It should have been in port for 3 months. It got 3 days. Steel was welded. While seamen scrubbed fuel from the decks, repair teams worked under arc lights for 72 hours, without sleep. When she pulled out again, she was still limping, but she floated, and she was armed. Japan believed fully that Yorktown was sunk there. After-action reports from Coral Sea confirmed it. They had watched it burn, reported the kill dot, so their plan assumed just 2 U.S. carriers left. Instead, 3 would meet them at Point Luck, 200 miles northeast of Midway already, waiting perfectly positioned because the enemy had read their mail. Still, the Japanese sailed as if surprise was guaranteed there. Scouting lines were drawn too thin. Flight paths too spaced, timetables too tight. They believed their carriers would reach Midway unchallenged, bomb the island. Force panic, then deal with desperate American reinforcements stumbling in after the fact. But the Americans weren't coming late. They were already watching the horizon. American bombers didn't fall into the trap. They set one of their own. When the Japanese launched their first strike on Midway, they knew a second would be needed. They began rearming aircraft below decks. While the first was still in the air, a fatal delay. Decks were crowded with torpedoes, fuel, and tightly stacked aircraft. That was the moment the war game had warned about, that vulnerable window, the one Ugaki had erased from the dice rolls. The real world didn't erase it. It just waited. NAG, OMO, commanding the carriers, was already scrambling. A scout plane from the cruiser. Tone launched 30 minutes late. It would fail to spot the American fleet until it was almost too late. When that scout finally reported enemy ships sighted, the message was vague. Nagumo, cautious, hesitant, trapped between the two halves of his plan, hesitated. He canceled the second Midway strike, then reversed, initiated rearming again, then stopped. Orders changed by the minute armament swapped again and again. On the decks, bombs were stacked beside fuel hoses. Crews ran, screamed, hauled weapons back and forth. A storm was coming, and the carriers would face it unprepared. Back in Pearl Harbor, a line was scratched into a notebook. The enemy has loaded his decks with gasoline and guesses. Midway didn't just go wrong, it went wrong in the exact way Japan had already seen. Just not the way they wanted to believe. The plan had become prophecy. Not because it was brilliant, but because no one dared to adjust it. When the dice showed disaster, they overruled the dice dot. Now real steel and fuel and blood would enter where cardboard once stood, and history doesn't let you re-roll. June 4th, 1942, Pacific Ocean, north of Midway. Aboard 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kagasoryu, and Hiryu, it was chaos disguised as precision. It began quietly. Planes launched from the flight decks before dawn, screaming into gray skies toward Midway Island. The objective was simple: bomb the American airfield into ash, disable its defenses, set the conditions for invasion. The strike force lifted off cleanly by 7:15 a.m. Nagumo's carriers temporarily were exposed. Most of their fighters were in the air, their decks busy but unguarded, their teeth for the briefest window. We're not ready to bite, and that's when the reports came in. A scout from the cruiser Tone, delayed by 30 minutes, finally radioed from Sector 5, enemy sighted. 10 ships, possibly carriers. That single phrase punched through the bridge of Akagi like a shell. Blast.Nagumo blinked. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The Americans were already here. The dice had warned this. Enemy carriers already in position, striking first while his own planes were out. He had overruled that scenario as unrealistic. Now it stared back at him from the sea. He hesitated. Should he launch the second strike against American ships, or finish off Midway's defenses first? His decks were crowded with planes armed for land attack, bombs, not torpedoes. So, at 7:40 a.m., he ordered rearming planes brought back down into hangars. Weapons swapped. Fuel lines reset. Then another report. 2 American carriers confirmed, closing fast. Panic spread. Nagumo reversed the order again, stopped the return torpedoes to planes. On deck, crewmen scrambled, hauling 800-pound bombs back to storage. Then, laying torpedoes beside crates of aviation fuel, hurried, angry, exhausted. The decks became tinderboxes. Then, at 10:22 a.m., the Americans arrived, not from the sea, from above. 30-7 Douglas SBD, Dauntless SBD, Dauntless dive bombers burst through a break in the clouds from USS Enterprise, descending with lethal silence. No alarms. No time. Japanese fighters were still circling low, having finished off waves of American torpedo bombers minutes earlier. The sky above was UNDE FENDED. In under 5 minutes, Kaga took 4 direct hits. Its hangar deck ignited like a bomb factory. Ammunition erupted. The ship became a furnace. Akagi was struck once, just once, but it was enough. A single bomb punched through the upper deck and exploded amid fueling hoses and torpedoes. Inferno Soryu hit by 3 1,000-pound bombs. The fire spread instantly. She would sink before nightfall. Deck crews were vaporized. Fighters unable to take off. Crews leaping from burning hulls into oil-covered water. Every scenario the dice predicted was now reality. 3 carriers, ... gone. Not over 3 days, in 5 minutes from his position aboard Akagi. Admiral Nagumo could only watch his flagship burn beneath him. He evacuated, and as he was ferried to the cruiser Nagara, smoke climbing into heaven behind him. He understood not in words. No officer ever said what needed saying, but the air did, silence did. This is what the dice saw. The next time Nagumo looked at the sea, Akagi was gone. The rearm order, his hesitation, the half-hour scout, delay the timing. ... Every piece of it. Laid out weeks earlier in Yamato's war. Game. Where 2 carriers had been sunk in rearming phase by aggressive American strikes. Ugaki had ruled it impossible. And now, it had happened. Exactly. The plan hadn't been defeated. It had simply played out, exactly as it once had. Only this time, the dice couldn't be overwritten. Reality never needed permission, and when it rolled high, they burned. They knew they were flying toward death. No illusions, no glory speeches, just orders, just belief. On the morning of June 4th, in the hours leading up to Japan's 5-minute unraveling, 3 squadrons of American torpedo bombers were already lined up on their decks. Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet, Torpedo Squadron 6 from USS Enterprise, Torpedo Squadron 3 from USS Yorktown. They flew Douglas TBD Devastators by 1942, obsolete death traps, slow underarmed, poorly armored. When fully loaded with a Mark 13 torpedo, they crawled at 115 miles per hour, slower than some destroyers. They required steady low altitude. Straighten attack runs directly into anti-aircraft fire, and every pilot in those cockpits knew that once they hit launch range, it was already too late, but they flew anyway. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, head of VT-8, told his men just before takeoff, "My greatest hope is that we will be successful. If there's only one of us left to make a final run, I want that man to go in and get a hit." His words weren't metaphors, they were instructions, and when they launched from Hornet, they did so without fighter escort. 7 o'clock hours, VT-8 begins its run. DEVASTATORS. No cover, flying. Straight into the heart of 4 Japanese carriers protected by dozens of Zeros and a wall of 25mm anti-aircraft batteries. The Japanese fighters descended on them like a guillotine, one by one. Waldron's planes fell torn apart midair, bursting into smoke or spiraling downward. Engines aflame. All 15 were destroyed. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived. He floated alone for 30 hours watching the battle rage from the sea. Hiding under his seat cushion as ships passed near enough to see faces, they hit nothing. But they did something else. They pulled every last Zero down to sea level. Exactly what fate or a gut instinct needed them to do. Next came VT-26 from Enterprise .14 planes. Different vector, same purpose. They met the same sky of fire. 10 were shot down. No torpedoes hit from Yorktown. VT-23 launched shortly after Daedalus. Had a few Wildcats for cover, fighters clawing through Zeros and desperation. It bought them seconds. No more. 12 of 13 were lost. Planes crashed with crews still. Inside, some dissolved on impact with the sea. Some tried to drop their torpedoes before they were hit. Engines screaming till the end. In less than 2 hours, 41 Devastators launched. Only 6 came back. Not one torpedo struck a Japanese ship. It looked like a complete failure. It WASN single quotes. Because while Zeros and flak guns hunted slow-moving torpedo planes down below, on the horizon, high above in the sun, undetected, came the Hammer, dive bombers SBD, holding altitude for exactly the window. Those torpedo bombers had bought with their lives, and then came the attack that turned the war. McCluskey Squadron from Enterprise, Leslie's from Yorktown. Plunging nearly vertically out of the clouds, bombs found Kaga Akagi. Soryo detonations tore through fuel lines. Detonated torpedoes stalked beneath decks. Fires spread like war songs in 5 minutes. The back of the Japanese fleet, broke Waldron's men, didn't live to see. It neither did most of VT-6 or VT-23, but they made it possible. The chaos they created the seconds they stole meant Japanese cap wasn't there when it mattered most. They didn't win. They enabled the win. That was their mission, and they achieved it with the rarest currency in war, certainty of death. One dauntless pilot would later write, "We saw the carriers. They were unprotected. And I knew right then, someone had died to let us get close enough to make it." Count McCluskey agreed. Every bomb drop that day carried on the shoulder-soft men who never made it home. The brass never said their names. Enough, the headlines never made heroes of them loud enough. But every dive that landed that morning belonged to Waldron, every man who followed him into the fire. They didn't rewrite the dice, ... They fulfilled them, not with proof of perfect strategy, but with sacrifice so unimaginable it became irreplaceable. When the Battle of Midway ended on June 7, 1942, 4 Japanese carriers were gone. 3,000 men lost beneath blackened waves. The offensive arm of the Imperial Navy, the same force that struck Pearl Harbor, raced in 72 hours. And yet, Tokyo announced a victory. Radio Tokyo. Every word broadcast to the Japanese public on June 8th, the enemy has been repelled with tremendous losses. Japanese forces are advancing. There was no mention of a Kaga no update on Kaga Soyu or Haryu, in fact. Those names would stay on the Japanese Navy's active rolls for months. Listed deployed, mission ongoing, but they were graves by then, graves with engines, graves with flight decks, all kept alive by lies. Wounded survivors were quarantined torpedo bomber pilots who had ditched in flames vanished, some sent inland. Others reassigned. Orders given. Never speak of Midway, even within the military. Only a handful of admirals knew the full truth. Strategic planning continued as if the carriers were still afloat. Training squadrons replaced lost pilots with raw recruits. Never told who they were replacing, just that they were off rotation. Some thought their mentors had been transferred. They hadn't. Historians would later call it a tactical denial spiral. The military leadership had built their plan on overconfidence, and when it failed, they doubled down. Not just because of shame, but because admitting what had happened would mean rebuilding the entire war effort from the ground up. They didn't have time. They didn't have ships. But more than anything, they didn't have the humility. Junior officers like Masatake Okumiya, who had umpired the war game, noticed the silence. They remembered how Ugaki had changed the dice. They remembered how the battlefield, months later, looked exactly as the game had predicted, but no one acknowledged the warning. Okamiya said nothing publicly. Years. Because everyone who had watched it go wrong was expected to help pretend it hadn't inside Japan. Mourning was quiet and controlled. Families of the lost received notices marked only killed honorably in service. Location undisclosed. No details. No photographs. No explanations. Mothers lit incense at shrines for sons who no longer existed on maps. Wives waited in empty doorways long after the telegrams stopped. And the people kept believing the carriers were still out there. The empire wasn't defeated at Midway. Had simply moved the truth out of sight. The deception was so complete that even some officers deployed months later still believed Akagi and Kaga were operational. Banners remained on display in army offices. Casualty reports, filtered. Who asked too many questions became unavailable. But as months passed, the cracks showed. Japan began pulling back. The next offensives stalled. Guadalcanal began. The machines ran slower. The pilots were younger, sloppier. Replacements didn't come fast enough. And beneath it, Ola quiet. Knowledge spread among those who had seen the wreckage. Midway hadn't just broken ships. It had broken belief. The officers who had stood over wargame tables just weeks earlier sat quiet in meetings. Nobody brought up the dice. Nobody spoke the name Ugaki, because they all knew the plan hadn't failed at sea. It had failed before it ever left the harbor. And when that single roll came up high, when the game shouted danger, disaster, dead ends, they had chosen not to listen. So now, with the real wrecks lying 17,000 feet beneath the sea, they chose one last silence. The Battle of Midway is remembered for flames, for dive bombers falling like hammers, for smoke curling off the burnt ribs of proud carriers. But that isn't where it started. It started when a dice roll said no, and a man said, "That's not possible." That moment, quiet, forgettable, buried inside Yamato's war room, was more important than any bomb dropped days later. Because there, in the comfort of a simulated war, Japan was handed a gift, a chance to prepare, a chance to adapt, a chance to survive. And it chose not to. The dice never lied. They showed the carriers burning. They pictured American pilots doing the unpredictable. They told Japan, this plan, as written, will collapse. But empires don't like bad news. And so, a war game became a fairy tale. The danger wasn't removed, it was hidden. Today, Midway is studied in every naval academy on Earth. Commanders replay those 5 minutes. Historians diagram every decision. Pilots are remembered. Codebreakers revered. But inside every retelling, there's another silence. The silence of honest warning rejected. That silence costs more than ships. It costs the future. Because this wasn't just a Japanese mistake, it's a human one. Any system, military, corporate, political, that punishes dissent and worships confidence, will lose to reality. Eventually, the dice come due. Modern military wargaming now teaches Midway's rigged simulation as a cautionary tale. Don't test just to confirm. Test to break the plan. If your wargame can't fail, it's already failed. Command College's reference, Okumiya's silent compliance. They warn about confirmation bias, the disease where failure is impossible until it arrives, because the most dangerous phrase in a war room isn't "we're outnumbered," it's "let's not consider that." Possibility. Ugaki isn't remembered as a villain. He wasn't cruel. A plan, .2, a legacy, .2, an outcome already, written in someone else's notebook for the rest of the war. Japan fought as if Midway hadn't happened. New tactics weren't developed. Carrier. Doctrine changed too late. The loss was hidden. Until Yamamoto himself was shot out of the sky by intelligence. Uganda believed Americans couldn't possibly have, but they had it. They had all of it, just like they had Midway. If Ugaki had listened to the dice, if he had let the carriers burn in the game, just maybe he wouldn't have had to see them burn in life. The ocean still holds them, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. Bones broken open at the bottom of the Pacific, not just by American bombs, but by a refusal to believe that bad things could happen to a perfect plan. The dice were right. The Admiral was not. They stood in dress uniforms on a battleship, rolling dice over a map of oceans they thought they owned. And when the dice spelled disaster, they simply said, no. But reality doesn't care what a game declares. Reality doesn't follow orders. And in 5 burning minutes near Midway Island, for Japanese carriers, vanished, just as the dice said they would. The dice had spoken truth. The Admiral chose silence, and 3,000 men paid for a lie, spoken in whispered protocol. Not because Japan was weak, but because Japan refused to admit it could lose the greatest failure. It wasn't tactical. It wasn't about fuel or fighters or bomb hits missed. It was believing that confidence mattered more than truth. Today, Akagi, Kaga, sword, and here you rest, 17,000 feet down, no flags, no fanfare, no one cheering on a strategy, only steel twisted by history, guarded by shadows, and watched by camera drones sent to remember where men once sailed too proudly forward. Midway is studied as a naval clash, a carrier duel, an intelligence victory, and it was all of that. But the war was already lost before takeoff. It was lost when the dice rolled high, and someone decided they were wrong. Subscribe for more forgotten warnings from history. More moments when silence was deadly. More stories where pride sank ships before the water ever did. Because you can ignore reality until reality rolls a 6.